Welcome to Lesson 3 of the topic Matter 2. The title for this lesson is Forming Ions, and our question for this lesson is what happens when atoms become ions. The key words for this lesson are atom, element, reactive, shell, valence electrons, ion, positive and negative. The first thing that we need to do is complete a knowledge check, so make sure that you pause the video and give yourself enough time to answer all 8 questions before the answers appear. So, non-metals form negative ions. The overall charge of an atom is neutral, that means no charge. The charge of electrons is negative, and it's -1 to be precise. The group of elements that are stable is group 0, meaning the noble gases. The charge of an ion, if the atom gained 2 electrons, is -2. Each electron has a -1 charge, so by gaining 2, the ion has -2 charge. The name of the electrons in the outer shell are valence electrons, and the reason why some atoms are unstable is because they have incomplete outer shells. The noble gases are stable because they do have full outer shells, whereas any atoms that don't have full outer shells are unstable, they are reactive. And lastly, metals form positive ions. Make sure that you mark your work and give yourself a mark out of 8. Make sure that you make any corrections that you need to. So why are some atoms reactive? We have already looked at this before, but just a recap then. So ions are atoms that have lost or gained electrons to fill their outer shell. They are no longer neutral and gain either a positive charge or a negative charge depending on whether they've lost or gained electrons. Remember that atoms are neutral because they have an equal amount of positive and negative charge. They have the same amount of protons and the same amount of electrons. Now, ions are more stable than atoms because they have this complete outer shell, whereas atoms have incomplete outer shells. They want to fill up that shell. That is why they are reactive. Whereas ions are stable, they are unreactive. Now, forming positive ions. So metals form positive ions. Hydrogen is the non-metal exception to this, and we looked at that a little bit last lesson. The outer shells of metals are close to empty, so they will happily lose just those few electrons that they have in order to get a full outer shell. So they will take the full outer shell underneath and just get rid of the spare electrons on the outer shell that they have and take the one underneath to be their new outer shell. For example, then, it is easier for sodium to lose 1 electron rather than to gain 7 to make up that full outer shell. Let's have a look at some examples then. So here we have in our table a sodium atom compared to a sodium ion. Now you can see that there are 3 electron shells on the sodium atom. It has 1 valence electron, 1 electron on the outer shell. You can see that it's got the same number of protons and electrons because it is an atom. So its overall charge is neutral, it's 0. Whereas the sodium ion, you can see it only has 2 shells, so it's taken that second shell and that is now its outer shell. And it is full, meaning that it is stable. It has 11 protons and now only 10 electrons, so it's got more positive charge than negative charge, which means that overall it has a charge of +1. because it's lost just one electron. That one electron has a charge of -1. So by losing that, the ion has an overall charge of +1. So by subtracting the number of electrons from the number of protons, we can calculate the charge of the ion. So you can see how the charge of the atom is neutral because you've got 11 and 11, so if you subtract them, you get 0, whereas for 11 and 10, if you subtract them, you get +1. In this case, losing one negative electron makes the ion positive by 1. So the charge on the ion links to the number of electrons it either loses or gains. In this case, it is losing one electron. So it gains a +1 charge. So now we will look at forming negative ions. So non-metals form negative ions. Again, hydrogen is the exception because it forms a positive one rather than a negative ion. The outer shells of non-metals are very close to being full, so it only needs to gain a few extra electrons to complete their outer shell. It is easier for them to do that than to lose the large amount of electrons in the outer shell that they do have. So for example, it is easier for oxygen to gain 2 electrons rather than lose 6. Again, let's have a look at an example then. So we've got our oxygen atom and we've got an oxide ion. So sometimes the names change when an element becomes an ion. So for the oxygen atom, we have 8 protons and 8 electrons. Atoms have the same amount of each. No overall charge. Now it has 6 electrons on its outer shell, which means it only needs 2 extra. So it gains those 2 electrons, which you can see then on the oxide ion. It now has 10 electrons compared to 8. So now it's got more negative charge than positive charge. If you subtract +8 from -8, you get -2. So the oxide ion has a charge of -2. So again, by subtracting the number of electrons from the number of protons, you can calculate the charge of the ion. This time it has actually gained electrons. That shouldn't be losing electrons at the bottom, it should be it's gained electrons. It's gained 2, so it's gained 2 -1 charges that add up to -2. Try to answer the question below. So describe the pattern between group 6 and group 7 and the ions that they all become. So use your periodic table. Remember that groups go down, they are columns. Find group 6 and group 7. Have a look at the outer shells, the valence electrons. Work out what the ions are and see if you can find the pattern. Make sure that you pause the video to give yourself enough time to do this. So, because group 6 and 7 elements are non-metals, they gain electrons because they only have a few extra electrons that they need. They've got lots of valence electrons, they're only missing a few, so they then gain these few electrons and become negative ions. That is then the pattern between group 6 and 7. They all become negative ions. Make sure that you mark your work and give yourself a mark if you got it right. Make sure that you add any corrections that you need to. Now, This is when you need to try and work out some ions by yourself. So it will give you can see that you have the atoms, and it tells you how many neutrons, protons and electrons that the atom normally has. So using that and the valence electrons, try and work out what the charge of the ion would be. Try and draw it with the shells and the electrons, and give the overall charge. Pause the video and give yourself enough time to try and fill in the table. So this is what your table should now look like, so make sure that you make any corrections that you need to. Now, because magnesium has 2 valence electrons, it loses those 2 electrons to get a positive 2 charge. And the fluorine atom has 7 electrons in its outer shell. It's so easy for it then to gain that 1 electron, which gives it a negative 1 charge, becoming a fluoride ion. Now that hopefully you have the hang of this, use your periodic table to then fill in the structure of the sulfur atom, and then try and do the same for the sulfide ion. Make sure that you pause the video to give yourself enough time to do this. So this is what your sulfur atom and sulfide ion should look like. So for the atom, it has 16 protons and 16 electrons. It's the same amount, so the overall charge is nothing, it's 0. In terms of the ion then, because it only needs to gain those 2 electrons to have a full outer shell, by gaining those 2 electrons, it now has a negative 2 charge. Make sure that you mark your work, make any corrections that you need to. So there is a knowledge check for you to complete. There is also an extension activity, so make sure that you pause the video and give yourself enough time to answer the questions before the answers appear. So here are the answers. The alternative name for a shell is energy level, with the highest energy level being the outer shell and the lowest energy level being the one closest to the nucleus. The charge of a proton is positive 1. The charge of an electron is negative 1. The reason why some atoms lose or gain electrons is because their outer shells are not complete. They are incomplete, so they need to either lose or gain electrons to have a full outer shell. So atoms have a neutral charge because they have equal amounts of protons and electrons. So they have the same amount of protons and electrons, so the same amount of positive and negative charge. Therefore they cancel out and atoms then have no charge. The charge of an ion that has gained 1 electron is negative 1, remembering that electrons themselves have a charge of negative 1, so if an ion gains that negative 1, it becomes negatively 1 charged. The charge of an ion that has lost 3 electrons, because each electron has a -1 charge and it's lost 3 of them, it means that the ion has a positive charge of 3, because it has 3 more protons than it does electrons. In atoms, they start off having equal amounts. When they lose electrons or gain electrons, that number then changes, so they have more of one than the other. This then gives it either a positive or a negative charge. The name of a chlorine atom that has become an ion is a chloride ion. And the extension activity suggests what would happen to the electrons if an atom in group 1 and an atom on group 7 came near each other. So electrons would be lost from the group 1 atom. So because they have less valence electrons, less electrons in their outer shell, it's easier for them to lose those, whereas the group 7 atoms, it is easier for them to gain a few rather than lose the many that they have. So the electrons from the group 1 atom will transfer to the group 7 atom. So the group 1 atom wants to lose electrons, the group 7 atom wants to gain electrons, so they both get what they want. Both atoms would then become ions, and they would then have full outer shells, so they would both be stable. Make sure that you mark your work, make any corrections that you need to. That is the end of the lesson. Thank you.